This is the fifth episode in a series of conversations with an international teacher of colour. The idea of these webinars is to reach out to international schools, organisations, and recruitment agencies to talk about how they are making systemic changes with regards to racial equity in their institutions. So I'll start with you, Cecilia. If you could just sort of give me a little bit about your background and your work and what you've done and where you are right now. That'd be really good to hear.
Yeah, for sure. So my name's Cicely Bell-Blaine. I run a diversity and inclusion consulting company called Backow Consulting, based here in Vancouver. We just celebrated 3 years of business, and I graduated from the United World College in Maastricht, where my mom was my teacher, and then I came to Canada to go to the University of British Columbia. And then soon after started my business, and we work with lots of different clients, many of whom are in the educational sphere, and we sort of do a lot of educational content around anti-racism and LGBTQ inclusion and basically everything under the D&I umbrella.
Perfect. That sounds amazing. And I just want to mention that you've written a book as well. Could you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, I've written a book. It's a collection of poetry and essays. It's called Burning Sugar. It's just there. And yeah, it's kind of like personal, but also talking about like systemic oppression and all of the things I'm passionate about educating, but just in a poetic format.
Fantastic. Thank you. And Antoinette, would you like to tell me a little bit about you and your background?
Yeah, I'm Antoinette Blaine. I'm Cicely's mum. I'm also an international teacher of colour. That's what drew me to your work, Dominique. I'm a teacher of visual arts, and I've been teaching internationally since 2010 in the Netherlands and Italy, and I'm currently a teacher coach in Mombasa, working across schools in the Aga Khan Development Network. So in normal times, I would travel to Hyderabad and Maputo, which are our other academies in the network.
Perfect. And what's drawn you both to this work, Cicely?
Well, I think for me, when I first graduated from university, I was working at a nonprofit, and the goal of the nonprofit was to go into different schools across the province here in BC and give youth educational content around LGBTQ inclusion. And I really loved that. And even when I went back to visit my mom in the Netherlands, I did some of those workshops for students there. And so I knew that kind of educational component of the work really interested me. And I also, at the same time, was very involved in Black Lives Matter here in Vancouver and other social movements, and kind of wanted to bring all of those things together as a way to change workplaces and classrooms to be more inclusive and to be more cognizant of, social issues, and to address, systemic racism and systemic sexism and so on and so forth that shows up in a lot of organizations of all kinds. So that's kind of what inspired me to get into this work. And then I founded my company in 2018, and it kind of just exploded from there. And, as I'm sure you know, over the past year, there's been a lot of interest in anti-racism. And so we've really grown to kind of meet that demand. And it's just really exciting to get to work with so many different organizations and be addressing these issues and helping people to feel like, to feel safer and to feel more included in their place of education or their place of work.
Yeah, it must be really exciting. I know there's so much going on, and I'm very new to this work. There's been a lot of things going on in our 3 schools, and so it's really interesting to connect to everybody and listen to lots of different perspectives and experiences. Antoinette, could you tell me a little bit about your school? And I'm going to sort of start with some of these questions now. And why is your school committed to making some changes?
Yeah, I think our school or our schools in the network have a really particular mission, probably slightly different. I think that's what I was interested in what you're doing, because I'm coming at it from a slightly different angle. So the mission and vision of the Aga Khan Academies is to um, it's part of a bigger development network. The overall mission and vision of the Aga Khan Academies is the idea of training ethical leaders in developing countries who will be educated internationally and have a global perspective, but will come back, will be sufficiently well rooted, and will have had, in addition to the learner profile, for example, we have the Aga Khan strands that we work with of ethics, pluralism, culture, governance, and civil society. So, in the hope that people will come back and be leaders and deal with challenges such as corruption, civil war, coming from countries in underdeveloped, with underdeveloped governance and civil society issues. So that's the kind of big picture mission, which is something that very much drew me. I worked at United World College, which has a similarly kind of noble mission. But I felt like they are not really tackling the brain drain idea of recruiting students from less developed countries and supporting them to have the skills to come back and make changes. So that's that's the vision of the organization.
That's amazing. And I'm just thinking of a linking question here between Cecilia and your experience when you were a student, compared to what is happening in your mum's school now. Has that sort of driven you to do this work and create your business and so forth in what you experience as a student, and sort of coming forward into your adult life now?
Yeah, definitely. I think, United World College for me was quite a pivotal time and was such a rewarding experience. It really kind of already, growing up in London, it's a very diverse place, and already was, deeply connected to lots of different types of people and lots of different cultures. But I think, going to sort of finish secondary school in the IB, in a UWC, you see so much more of the world, and you learn so much more about different, social issues that are facing different communities. And I think the idea of activism being part of your education, I think, is what really inspired me about that time at UWC, because, yes, in my first school in London, we were encouraged, of course, to be open-minded and global thinkers, but I think there was a big disconnect between how do you actually make change, how do you actually be an activist, how do you, even just like language of like feminism, for example, wasn't really introduced to me until going to UWC. So I think that was a really pivotal time for me, is meeting other people who are driven to create change, and many UWC graduates kind of go on to do similar work to what I'm doing, or to, be leaders in their community and stuff like that. So yeah, I think that played a huge role in what I do now. And, UWC is still, it's a very connected movement. So I'm still friends with a lot of people. I just got elected to the UWC's first anti-racism and DEI steering committee. So there's 14 UWC graduates from across the entire UWC network who are interested in sort of shaping the future of what anti-racism looks like on all the campuses. So it's kind of like, once you're in it, you never really get out, but usually for the better.
Yeah, they do have a very good structure there. I spoke to Erin Robinson the other day. Really interesting. And we've sort of looked at what they've got on their website as well. So
Mm.
how, when you're thinking of those experiences from UWC, how have you brought those experiences into your business now, and how's that helping shape what you drive forward to try to do your goals and things like that?
Yeah, I would say for me the sort of driving force behind my work is to connect or to take on the values and principles of, you know, what it means to be a change maker or what it means to be an activist, and allow people in professional or educational capacities to learn the skills of that. So oftentimes there's this like big disconnect where we see, you know, for example, we see a movement like Black Lives Matter, and it's posited as the antithesis of what it means to be, you know, in a professional space, right? It's not professional to, you know, be out on the streets protesting and so on and so forth. So for me, it's always been a passion of mine to bridge those gaps and to help people recognize there's lots of skills and knowledge and values that you can learn from being an activist, that can be translated into a professional or educational setting. And I think that's something I didn't necessarily have the language for that at the time, but something that I learned at UWC is, you know, it's not, yeah, you know, I think in for most people, their school experience is you're kind of the, you know, you're the sort of disruptor or you're the instigator if you're sort of outspoken about feminism or you're outspoken about queer issues. Whereas at UWC, that's something that's really valued and in fact encouraged. So I think that was kind of important for me to bring that into the work that I do now. Is yeah, it's not some, you know, to be interested in changing, you know, how things function, because they don't always function well, is not something to be ashamed or embarrassed of. In fact, I think it has a lot of value to teach us about, you know, how we can change workplaces to be more inclusive for everyone.
That's great. Yeah, that's really interesting to sort of have that connection and talk about inclusion as well. And that's going to help me lead on to my next question with Antoinette. When you're thinking about this work, how do you include all of your staff at your, you know, the school that you're at in Mombasa, and maybe the wider community of schools? That's quite a general question. So
Yeah.
first of all, how would you involve the staff directly? And I suppose if we sort of think about this, the expat staff and the local staff.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the core of something that isn't really happening, and something, for example, that I think, you know, I know that when Cicely comes to visit, we will be locking her into lots of workshops here, because there is the assumption that because most of my colleagues are Black and local, that there isn't any kind of racism happening, and the staff themselves are not interested in unpicking, for example, the very strong tribalism that still is present here in Kenya, and in fact sort of supersedes all politics when it comes to election time. So that is something that's very difficult to ask, even just out of a very superficial level of interest about, in a way that, you know, in the UK, for example, was something you couldn't really ask about race when I was growing up in the 70s. You know, it's something that you couldn't really talk about. So there is that that issue, and there's also this kind of double-edged thing of suddenly being in a place where, as somebody that identifies as being of color, but having all the privileges, you know, like this kind of new reading of my own identity. And I think that my white colleagues already, you know, it's very difficult to open a discussion, for example, of like the kind of white savior mentality that you meet in not within the school necessarily, because a lot of people are here mainly driven by a desire for adventure and travel and different things, but amongst, for example, some of the people in other development networks that you might meet in Kenya. So that doesn't really answer your question, but we don't really have a diversity or inclusion discussion even going on. I think the same is true of the students. I think even though part of the acknowledged mission of the school is that students will leave for university, we're not really thinking about preparing them for what the kind of attitudes and the racism that they will inevitably meet, because our students are they're not financially privileged, because it's a needs blind admission process, and there's a lot of different scholarships and different financial support for our students, and some of them do come from really challenging circumstances. But the part that we haven't yet catered for is if they go to the States, they are really ill-equipped to deal with the attitudes that they might find there, especially the what's the term I want, Cicely? The kind of the hidden assumptions,
microaggressions,
implicit bias.
they'll meet. Yeah, both of those things they will meet on a regular basis when they get to another European or North American university.
So do you think there's a need then for that work?
Sorry, just to yeah, that's what I was just going to kind of sum up, say that I can't tell you of what the current experience is because it's not really happening, but the assumption that it doesn't need to happen because we're in Africa and most of the staff are Black doesn't mean it doesn't need to happen. It still needs to, the discussion still needs to happen.
Because I'm assuming that a lot of the students at your school will or aim to go to universities in the US or the UK or some other Western countries, and the racism that they might experience there may be very different to any that they experience in in Kenya or whatever. And so are there any discussions to raise awareness of these differences and the different meanings of some of the words that might be used in some of these countries? And so I'll post that to you, Antoinette, first, and then once Antoinette's spoken a little bit about it, Cicely, what can be done about that when they come to these Western countries?
I think it kind of speaks to what Cicely was saying just now about equipping students to be activists. So the school does have a really rigorous service program, and students are activists about, in an authentic way, about things that they're passionate about. But it really hasn't crossed their horizon that it might even be a thing that you go to university and somebody like your university lecturer might behave in a racist way towards you. I think I could say students here that would be really unimaginable to them because of different structures within this culture of things like, somebody highly educated is somebody really to be revered, and the education is a really or formal education at university is such a life-changing opportunity that it's kind of a bit like at UWC. It's always kind of like the golden ticket. So there's a kind of rose-colored spectacle idea about what they're going to find there. So students are equipped to be activists, but it's not the things that they choose to fight against. And there's lots of really important things that they work towards about, you know, how women are treated either here or in their home country. And they're doing, you know, they definitely have the skills to campaign about the things that they need, but to expand on that, to see what they might need in the future, of course, is a difficult thing for them to do at their age, or for anybody to do.
Yeah, I think I can relate to that, because my son is currently thinking of going to the US, and he's in 12th grade right now. So that's what he's contemplating, and we just want him to understand the differences. And so, Cicely, those students coming across from different countries where they may not have experienced the same type of, you know, racism or discrimination, how can they be equipped? And through an organisation like yours, you know, what have you sort of done to try and find experiences for these students or people coming into the world, and the organisations you sort of work with?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I definitely, you know, encountered the same issues, like working with UWCs, and it's almost kind of an expected pipeline almost, that, you know, you go to a UWC, the likelihood of you ending up in a, you know, in the US is pretty high. And yeah, you're kind of sending off a lot of Black students into a place where, yeah, they're at much greater risk because of the color of their skin. And I think, you know, I think there's a certain extent to which people can be prepared for that experience. I think, and, you know, especially seeing, one of my clients is the MasterCard Foundation, which brings a lot of students from sub-Saharan Africa to universities in Canada. And yeah, a lot of students are really struggling with the sort of, not just culture shock, but also, especially coming here to Vancouver, where the Black population is, you know, less than 1%, that experience of kind of, you know, being the only Black person in your classroom, or, you know, things like that. It's hard to sort of equip people for those experiences. I think there's some conversations that can be had about, like, you know, self-empowerment and, you know, gaining the tools to speak up for yourself in ways that you haven't needed to before. And, you know, I think it's kind of like maybe like a two-pronged piece, where there's maybe some work that needs to be done before students are sent into those places. And I think also that requires, you know, Western universities are put on such a pedestal, and I think maybe they need to be brought like a little notch down, especially for students of color, because yes, the qualification you get could change your life, but the actual experience to go through 3 to 4 years of that could be quite grueling for a lot of people, when you're not only experiencing those ongoing microaggressions, plus those more explicit forms of racism, plus, you know, especially if you're in North America, potential like actual, you know, physical danger. So yeah, I think there definitely needs to be more of that in terms of, you know, when we're presenting opportunities to students, especially in you know, if we're saying, you know, go to the US, go to Canada. Yeah, I think they need to be given that information straight up so that they can make a more informed decision. And I would also say that, you know, especially when people are coming from different cultural contexts, a lot of students, like I have a workshop tomorrow, for example, which is for international students at the University of British Columbia. And a lot of them are very curious about how to get into Canadian workplaces. And part of that is understanding how diversity and inclusion looks here, which might be different. You know, there's different issues on the table, like, you know, expectations around like sexual orientation and gender identity, which maybe aren't talked about as much in other parts of the world. And so there's also that layer of equipping people to engage in, in dialogue around social issues that maybe aren't on the table where they're coming from as well. So yeah, a lot of my talks with international students have been, these are the expectations of a Canadian workplace, for example. These are the human rights code. This is the, in BC we have a very, very thorough human rights code. It protects over, I think, 16 identity designations, which is quite a lot more than a lot of other places. And so it's also equipping people to participate in that level of inclusion of others as well as as well as themselves.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so, I mean, you have things set in place, where you're living for people to come over there. But do you find that because these students are coming from various countries around the world, they have their own implicit bias about certain things? They are maybe ill-equipped as well to sort of deal with some of these situations. Are you finding a lot of that? And do you really think there should be more work done in the international schools first?
Yeah, I think it's a really fine line between like cultural relativity and equipping people for different sort of social standards in different places. I think, for example, there's maybe a stereotype that African countries or African people are inherently more homophobic, as one example, which is not necessarily true. I think that's mainly, an unfair stereotype. But I do think, living in a place like Vancouver, for example, it is a lot safer, mainly because of the laws, not necessarily the individual people. So I do think there is some element that international schools are responsible for in terms of just letting people know a bit more about the cultural context that they're walking into. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from the lens of, you can't be homophobic when you get to Canada. Like, it doesn't have to be like that. It can be actually on the flip side, if you're someone, you actually have more freedom to explore your identity or to, be who you want to be, maybe in ways that you weren't free to do elsewhere. Or, you can explore, you can change your name, or like you can explore your gender identity, and kind of it can be a positive thing of all of the things that are available to you that maybe aren't available in certain contexts. So I do think there is some layer of, as we're preparing people for like the academic environment they might be going into, also preparing people for the socio-political context that they're going into as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's so much work that does need to be done in a lot of schools. And speaking to a variety of people, there are some schools who've done work for years, some schools who've just been woken up in the last year and realise that they do need to do that work. Antoinette, so because of these situations that the students might find themselves in, how would you see in your schools in Khan Academy, what things could you see that could be put in place in preparation for these students across what goals do you think the Academy needs to try to meet for these students getting ready to leave to sort of go into university and to different countries? And sorry, one more bit. How do you think that could be implemented in a way? Because it seems as if it could be a challenge.
Yeah, I think it's part of the, if you think about the critical thinking part of the IB learner profile, and what does that really mean, and how do we actually work with that? So the Aga Khan networks have these extra learner profile pieces, which I think, one of which is pluralism. And so for us, I think all the way through our pastoral program, there needs to be this piece about cultural mediation, actually looking at cultural theories. So we did some work really recently on how to teach the Aga Khan strands through these different lenses, one of which was about critical thinking. And my work was really about if we can compare that cultural iceberg of how we usually deal with, especially in international schools, the international mindedness or global citizenship and these ideas, we just kind of skip through it. But if we could just dig into that a little bit, we could come to those ideas about what it means to be of any particular ethnicity, and dig in a little deeper to the students, because we do, although we're not an international school, because of our scholarship program, we have students from really quite remote parts of the world. So here in Mombasa, we have a cohort of students from Tajikistan, and our academy in Maputo is about to receive one. And Afghanistan, we have Afghanistan students going to the academy in Hyderabad. So these are really, really distant cultures from where they find themselves. Like the Tajik kids find themselves to be more or less the only white kids on campus, white looking kids on campus. And the preparation for those students coming from such a remote area is really rigorous. It's really quite an amazing program in place. And I think we just need to pick up that rigor when they get there with all of our students, because even a student coming from our neighboring country of Uganda comes from a country that, like Cicely was saying about the stereotype of homophobia, but it is, LGBT people in that country are very strongly persecuted. It's a very dangerous country. So although attitudes in Kenya are very conservative, and particularly here on the coast, it's Ugandan students will already be coming to what they think is a much more tolerant country. And then we've got students coming from literally, a mountain range in Tajikistan who have probably never seen dark-skinned people at all. And so I think we kind of start off with this idea that we're really supporting students coming from very different cultural contexts, but we haven't quite got there with the maintaining that discussion throughout the whole MYP into DP years. And I think there's a tendency also to think it's something for the DP, it's something as we're preparing to send them out into the world. But that's why we have this iceberg thing going on of we haven't got to the level of understanding by the time they get to the DP, because we're not structuring those skills a little bit better throughout, and PYP throughout the younger years.
And so do you think there is a need to have more of an impact at a younger age so that that understanding can carry through and you can have some form of structure as we go along, and it leads into students being prepared when they leave school, they are more prepared, rather than it sort of having this sort of last couple of years getting prepared for school. Okay, hey guys, you've got to know this as well. And just to add to that, is it easier? I know this is a sort of big area. Is it easier to sort of have more of an impact in like the advisory program or within the curriculum?
Yeah, I think one of the relatively new initiatives here has been about training the teachers to better implement these AK strands in their teaching. And I think once we can make that link, for example, with ethics or with pluralism, specifically in our teaching, then it's the idea being it's going to make it real for the students, and we can, you know, students can see what it really means to be in the science, for example, to be an ethical scientist, to be in history, looking at pluralism means you have to look at other people's opinions on what happened in the Second World War, for example, or whatever it is that they're studying in history. So that's, you know, as soon as that is fully rolled out, I think that will make a big difference, because teachers will be teaching from a perspective or from a lens through which we can dig into these issues a bit more authentically.
Absolutely, yeah. I think there's a lot of work to try to get teachers on board sometimes, and obviously I think in your schools there, you have, I'm assuming you have the structures put in place to bring in the right teachers so that they understand what your philosophy is in bringing these kids forward. But I think the difficulty you are finding is that you have such a variety of kids, and it's not about them coming from other international schools and sort of having the same experiences and then coming, they're coming from such remote places, and so that could be that's an interesting sort of mix, I suppose, and it'll be really interesting to sort of see how that works. Okay, so I just want to thank both of you. It's been a fantastic conversation. I've learned so much, and I'm glad that there's been a connection between both of you as well. And you know, I hope that we can connect again sometime, maybe later this year, and sort of continue our conversations. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having us. This has been great.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's been really interesting, and I wish you lots of luck with the work you're doing. I think it's fantastic.
Thank you.